SoulFood Coffeehouse in Redmond, Washington. This is Astrology Night for May 2014. And welcome back, Jeff.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for doing such a great job last month.
It was an easy month to do a great job because the planets were out of hand.
Yeah, and the numbers of people who watched this presentation here last month was 16,000 people, more than twice as much as the most we've ever had in a single month. So sitting through, with your help and your support, somewhat serious discussion of astrological patterns, thank you for helping make Astrology Night at Soul Food work.
Yeah. So, how many people here made it through April? Oh, wait a minute. I guess all of you. April was one of those months that prove that we can go on and on and on about astrology, but we really don't know crap. No, and what I mean by that is that it was the most extraordinary month from an astrological point of view in a long time. However, now looking back at it, it was just another month. This is just as extraordinary month as that was because this month is now.
Yeah, I've been trying to come up with a possible astrological reason why, even though we've got crap blowing up and, you know, ferry boats flipping over and people dying and the usual crap that goes on all the time. I agree with Rick. The extraterrestrials didn't land. Joe Biden didn't have his sex change operation. You know, most of us still have electrical power. For the average person, life was not disturbed in obvious ways. And perhaps it's because of the great diplomatic work of Mars in Libra. Look, the story, the backstory, as I'm sure most of you know, is revolutionary Uranus in Aries and transformational Pluto in Capricorn, making right angles with one another 7 times between 2012 and 2015. And last month, big jolly Jupiter, expansive, joined the party. And Mars joined to make a grand square. And while normally we think that's explosive, Mars is retrograde. The trigger man, Mars, didn't pull the trigger in a larger collective sense.
Because the gun was aiming at himself.
Well, right, and that may be. You know, the peacemaker holds himself hostage. So, you know, we've been given another opportunity here to breathe, at least cosmically speaking, and to get back to the serious business of radically transforming the world. That's not going away. The backstory doesn't change simply because on the surface most things look the same.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think there's another piece to this story. And I agree that Mars being retrograde really did have a bit to do with things not happening, maybe. It being in Libra being kind of a negotiating point also, maybe. But I think there's another piece here. And that is, if we look back in the 1960s at the 2 exact dates of the Uranus-Pluto squares and the Uranus-Pluto conjunctions in the summer of 1965 and 66, the real action of what we look at happened in the 60s didn't happen on the dates of the exact conjunction. I call it, you know, we learned in school this thing called the lag of seasons. Why the longest day of the year, why you know, June 21st when there's the most sunlight, why isn't that the hottest day? It takes time for things to catch up. And by the same token, although the exact conjunctions were in 1965 and 66, the action was in 67, 68, 69, 70. Those are the major historical events that we look at, or at least some of them continued. And from that standpoint, there may have been setups here that when we look back historically, we see things like the Ukraine and what's going on in the Crimea. We don't know how that's going to play out, but there may be key events that happened that are just events as they're happening, but gain perspective as we look back at them in a year or 2 or 3.
Yeah, and of course, the news that we all live every day is our own lives. It's not what's happening in some faraway place. And certainly, whether it's astrologically induced, which I hope not, or just a reflection of these times, there's still a great deal of tension in the air. And I think what this month is about is building the ark, because the sun is in Taurus, the most grounded, densest sign of all. It is the fixed earth sign, which has to do with using the materials of this planet and on a psychological level, finding a place of safe haven and comfort, but not to hide away from the wolf, but to put on the armor and be the wolf. Again, as we've talked month after month over these past couple of years, it is about being the change that you want to occur. And while the dominant astrological theme this month is not as explosive looking, we're getting feedback here, Eric, thank you, was not as explosive looking as last month, we have a core centerpiece, the full moon this month, which is about building our container. If you want to do magical work, if you want to do transformative work, this is a time in which you get to figure out what you need and what you have to do to build the vessel of your own transformation.
Yeah, I think that... What? Huh? I think what you're saying about Taurus, about the sun being in Taurus, even Mercury being in Taurus also now, I think that this is true, that there really is a solidness. It's the three-dimensional reality. What are we looking at?
We're a week out.
Oh, well, yeah, we're on May
Gemini.
1st. Yeah, okay.
At any rate.
Well, there we go. I was on the 1st of May. The fact, oh yeah, Mercury has now moved on into Gemini, but this sun in Taurus really is an anchor point, and it's also important that the sun in Taurus over the last few days made a harmonizing trine with Pluto, which was one of the key planets in this grand square. And whenever trines are made to planets that are square other planets, the trines help reduce the pressure.
Yeah, and hopefully with the trine from Pluto, it's about being resourceful.
Right.
See, Pluto is a planet that digs deep, and Saturn, a planet of dealing with hard things, is in Pluto's deep digging sign of Scorpio. And what's happening is the sun in bucolic Taurus is moving into an exact opposition to Saturn in 3 days, on the 10th of this month.
1, 2, 3.
That's an encounter between the conscious will and desire of the sun and Taurus, again, to be self-validating, self-accepting, and comfortable. And yet the opposition with limit-defining, hungry Scorpio sort of brings things, particularly on a material and self-worth level, perhaps toward a boiling point, which will come for the next several days.
Yeah, and it's, you use the word boiling point, it's almost a crystallization point also. I mean, because when Saturn is involved, often that takes whatever has been an idea or out in the ethers, and the sun's opposition to Saturn, we think of it sometimes as meeting resistance. But when we meet resistance, the push-pull back and forth actually condenses or crystallizes something out of the energy. And I think that the sun's opposition to Saturn here is again part of the building the ark. It's the making it real. There's something that happens here. It's not just bumping into a wall. It's actually having another thing that helps define. You used the word container before, and I think that's a good word. But with Saturn involved, I mean, in alchemistry, where something is transformed into something else, the word is alembic. And the alembic is that glass kind of thing with the weird top that holds the reaction. And Saturn is part of that container here, and I think that that's really an important piece of this month's stuff.
Yeah, and we get into interesting astrological principles. Saturn, Rick is right, Saturn is a planet of crystallization, it's a planet of containment. Scorpio goes both ways. Scorpio is a fixed water sign, represents contained emotions, but which do, when contained for too long or under enough pressure, boil over. And what I was really pointing toward is 4 days later, on the 14th of May, we have the full moon. And if Saturn is in opposition to the Sun, operating perhaps as a dampening force, full moons in Scorpio do boil over. They're really heated. And that's really what I was pointing to in terms of the preparation that we make in terms of our values, our material comfort, and our emotional comfort or discomfort, and what we must do to be containers of the transformational energies of these times. This is why this month it is so valuable, I think, to really assess your needs, your desires, your values, and look at them in a way that's committed to more engagement. Because the one thing that Saturn certainly says, if you don't take action, then action will be imposed upon you in ways that diminish your opportunities.
I want to go back for a moment, so that we just back far enough so that we can see that grand square again. Back, that was exact around April 20th to 23rd, but was still hanging in there at the beginning of the month, and still is now, really. I mean, can you see the square involving Uranus opposite Mars, Jupiter opposite Pluto, and each of them mutually 90 degrees to one another? And I think it's important to understand this month that that opposition, those oppositions and squares, are still relatively close. I mean, even though we consider it over, the fact of the matter is that Uranus to Pluto is still only a degree from being exact, and Jupiter's only a couple of degrees off, and Mars, although it's moving a little faster, is a few degrees off. Mars, remember, is going to continue retrograding, and then it goes direct back through all this again, not until, what, June?
Yeah, Mars turns direct finally on the 19th of this month. The planet of action begins to regain forward motion.
So this whole grand square energy, it's not like it was just one day. And in fact, you talked about the Saturn opposition to the Sun as coming into the full moon period, but we also have just a day later another opposition between Venus opposite Mars. Now remember, Mars was one of the culprits in the grand square. So as Venus comes into opposite Mars, she's also then going to line up with Uranus, square Pluto, and square Jupiter. And so we're really right back in the midst of this thing again. It's not quite the same, but it's still pretty powerful. And this opposition, I think, I think you're right. There's a boiling over, maybe even, it's not really boiling, it's a volcano exploding. I mean, it's hot. And if it was just water, it would be boiling. But under such pressure, there's like it can be an explosion if we don't work to keep the energy moving.
Right, and that is the critical thing at this time in history from an astrological perspective.
To keep the energy moving.
Absolutely. Even though it can be cataclysmic to make some choices in your life, it's safer to take risks at this time in cosmic history than it is to play it safe. And if we project that on the culture, if we are to play it safe, that is to say not rock the boat or push against resistance, well, we will continue to poison the planet. And spiritually, whatever it is, but taste-wise and creatively, I think we can do more interesting things. So we're still in that period of making choices, but here's the interesting thing, or an interesting thing. As Rick pointed out, Venus, the goddess of love or pleasure, comes in to the squares, the square to Pluto, the square to Uranus, a conjunction to Uranus and square to Jupiter, meaning that the breakthrough places may have to do much more with personal relationships this month. You know what it's like. If you have anxiety over a big issue in your life that might not have anything to do with your primary relationship, it's still your primary relationship, which can be the place where you explode or let things out. And I think that's part of what we're looking at this month, which is Venus, which is the planet of love and pleasure, but she's in Aries, and she's kind of looking for trouble to begin with. Or at least she wants to be where the sailors are. Because Venus in Aries is suggesting...
Hey, I have one of those in my chart.
You have a sailor in your chart? But the principle of Aries is the pioneer. Aries is this independent, raw, spontaneous, immediate energy which the planet of love is now in. Meaning that love and pleasure and self-worth, to a certain extent, are filtered through the need for, on one side, immediate pleasure, on another side, something new, but certainly this sense of freshness to bring our hearts alive. And because of that, again, we can take the fear we have about our careers, or our concerns about our health, or about our relatives, and easily look at our partner and see them as boring, or see them as the source of our discontent.
Yeah.
We also have, oh, I'm sorry.
No,
just to cause trouble with your partner, there's the Mars-Venus opposition,
right,
which are the fighting lovers.
Well, and they are, and of course, fighting lovers can be a lot of fun, depending upon how you're working out the energy. No, seriously.
And how many you have to fight at a time. I think that's
don't go there. But what's interesting in this opposition, which I'm now, I think, a day ahead. I think there's the opposition exactly on the 11th. But what's interesting about this opposition is that Mars is in Libra, which is Venus's sign, Libra. Venus and Libra go together. And Venus is in Aries, which is Mars's sign. These guys, the technical term for this in astrology is called mutual reception. The planets are in each other's signs, which means that even if they weren't exactly in opposition, they're still kind of handing cards back and forth under the table. They're still communicating with each other, and there can be a bit of a role reversal here, where Mars, the planet of assertiveness and aggression, is being nice, and Venus, the planet of nice, is being aggressive, because the two are in each other's signs. And I think that this is another important piece. One other thing you were talking about, playing it safe. I agree with you completely, but the words playing it, actually the way we can play it safe is by jumping in. And it's really playing it fearful. What we think of as playing it safe, holding on to the past, is not safe. It's fearful. It's that afraid, and the only way to play it safe is to let go of fear and to move into the current, to move into the change, to take personal risks, to do what you can do to stir the energy up on an interpersonal level, because the global change always begins with the individual change.
Yeah, yeah. And what I'm thinking here too is, it's easy to get itchy in terms of looking for new forms of fun or excitement or validation in one's life with this opposition. And remember, it's okay to think about anything. It's okay to think about any kind of behavior. In other words, because Venus, the planet of love, she's in pioneering Aries. She's looking across at wimpy Mars in Libra, who may be handsome as could be, but she's bored, sick of him, because all he wants is everything to be nice. She's square to Pluto and a little bit ornery with that, and on her way to Uranus, which means she's willing to throw down, to risk it all, to go into it fully. And that, again, is why I think standing still with cardinal signs, with these patterns that we're having, is counterintuitive. Now, the big thing is, what the full moon and what Taurus and Scorpio are about is to know the worth of what you really want. See, Venus is tricky. Venus can tell us what we like alcoholics liking alcohol or sugar hungry. Venus is not necessarily, in whatever sign she's in, she's not about preservation, which is what the moon is about. Venus can be a hot date or a great meal or a sweet taste in your mouth, The moon is a life. The moon is a domestic situation. The moon is an ongoing habit pattern and diet. So if you are going to go all in and take that risks, at least know what's at stake. What it is you're really looking for. And perhaps most importantly, with the full moon in Scorpio, what are you willing to give up?
Yeah, and I think we do need to give up something, because remember, this full moon in Scorpio is also lined up with the full moon is conjunct, the sun is opposed Saturn, and so it brings that whole thing back of what is the limitation, what do you have to give up in order to get what it is you want. One other thing I want to say about Venus in Aries, especially as she gets close to conjuncting Uranus, I think on the 15th, Venus in Aries, I mean, there's this whole thing about pleasure for sure, but she can be a bit selfish, or maybe a lot selfish. And when she's conjunct Uranus, she can think of things that she normally wouldn't think of, and without saying no, or without acknowledging that Saturnian limit, she can find herself in a bit of a mess, because she extends too much too far. I mean, there's some great pressure here, and I'm not saying that this is a double negative. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I think that Venus can actually take us too far. We need to pay attention to how that works.
Well, you have to know the cost. Let's say you're in a relationship, and you find yourself, and the relationship is all right, and you find yourself, perhaps against your thoughts, attracted to someone else. And that can be very exciting, and that's what we're looking for. That's what Venus is looking for, excitement.
Especially lined up with Uranus, which is the suddenness and the adrenaline
and the
rush
newness,
of the moment.
Yeah, and the discovery and the liberation and all of that stuff. But what the full moon is about is there are going to be consequences for this. And are you willing to risk what you have to go for something new? And I think once you make that calculation, then you're safe no matter what happens. Because in any negotiation going into it, recognizing what the downside could be for you, whether it's losing your job or ending a relationship, whatever, if you've calculated that in and still choose to act, well, then you've made a conscious choice. And even if you don't get the outcome that you want in the short term, you're likely to be rewarded in the long term, because you have done the yoga. The yoga is do something exciting and risky this month, but calculate what it costs for you to do that. That's a key piece of the mid-May assignment.
Yeah, and I think we have some nice help. I mean, maybe one of the difficulties of April was we had a lot of these stressful aspects, but not a lot of ease in working them out. And remember, before I said that when we have a trine or a harmonious aspect to one of the square planets, that helps relieve the pressure. Well, this is true also with sextiles. And on the day that Venus and Uranus, Venus love, Uranus sudden, you know, that erratic attraction, on the day that that's exact, Mercury in mid-Gemini is sextile, that's harmonizing or supporting that. And so I think here communication becomes a piece of working this out. I think you said earlier, we can entertain all possibilities. It doesn't mean we have to do them, but it's helpful to think about them to take the pressure off. In other words, resisting it makes it bigger. But if we actually allow the thoughts to flow, that helps the energy again to move. Or in communicating it with a friend or a lover, doesn't mean you have to do it, but in creating open dialogue, again, that takes the pressure off there. The other piece that is building, or that was building pressure, is the Jupiter, which late last month was opposite Pluto and square Uranus. And over this month, that Jupiter comes into an exact trine. This is part of a repetitive pattern with Saturn, and that's exact on the 24th. And there we go, right there. And here again, because Jupiter was one of the stressful planets, here we get the good news side of Saturn that is giving, it's again about the container. It's another piece of the arc that you were talking about before that is the structure to this whole sense of largesse or expansive nature that we have. And I think that these trines and sextiles are both very important this month to work with.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, going back to where Rick was talking about Mercury, the communicator in Gemini, harmonizing with Venus in Aries, which can certainly be good social communication, but it can be great social rationalization and lying. Mercury is quincunx Pluto at the time. The idea is don't talk somebody else into being flexible about what you want them to do. And don't let anybody talk you into doing what they want to do. Find the flexibility in yourself and be that. That's when Mercury in Gemini is reflective of a growing mind rather than a tool for manipulation. And the Mercury-Pluto quincunx, Rick, is why I brought that up.
Oh yeah,
it's the charming liar.
It's the charming liar, and it's also the difficulty we have in knowing which side of the mouth we're talking out of is true. In other words, we can convince, it's not just that we can be misleading someone else. We actually have a hard time judging what truth is or how much facts to apply to the persuasion. I have an agenda, I'm trying to talk you into it or whatever. Where do my facts become opinions? And how do I present them? Because Mercury is intellect and rationalization. In Gemini, it's very facile. I mean, this is the clever, the witty, the mental tap dancer, and that it's in this kind of awkward relationship with Pluto and Capricorn, says it's really hard to know how much intensity to apply to any given situation.
Right, so basically the middle of May is pretty intense and complex, but as Rick pointed out, we're coming toward a trine between Jupiter and Saturn, the most harmonious relationship possible between any pair of planets. This 1/3 of the circle represents positive resonance, a healthy, cooperative relationship between Saturn, the planet of limits and hard-cold reality, and Jupiter, the planet of growth and expansion. The grown-ups are home. Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter is higher mind, and Saturn is responsibility, and the harmonious relationship between these two in sensitive, feeling-oriented water signs is very good for trusting gut instincts for long-range planning, which is often career, but in terms of the bigger picture things. So the good news is that if on the social level you get a little off, you behave a little weirdly, you think in ways that are a little strange, you buy things that aren't the best, what this represents is a more mature perspective. Now, I never thought I would talk about a mature perspective, Rick, when the sun was entering Gemini. Because even though this Jupiter-Saturn trine represents a higher order capacity to make big plans, to know Saturn in Scorpio what you really need, and Jupiter in Cancer to find the fuel to be able to head yourself in that direction. And yet, at the same time, or similarly in the last week of the month, the sun of will and consciousness, the basic life force occupying the center of our solar system, moves into youthful, bouncy, playful. Do I really have to make a choice? It's this or this? Okay, I'll take both. So,
and that's on May 20.
That's on May 20. So even though there is a higher order of reason with the Jupiter-Saturn trine, there is a sort of lower order sense of perhaps instability or immaturity.
Yeah, and that sun moving into Gemini on May 20th, all the way through the 31st, through the last day of the month, that sun is gaining on an exact trine to Mars, and that's the culmination of the month, which again is another supportive or harmonious aspect to another one of the problem planets.
Yeah, and again, one of the things we run into in Taurus is, I want my stuff. I want to keep what I have, or I want
especially
this.
if you can eat it.
Well, yeah, but even if you're not, I don't want the Model 1B, I want the Model 1A. That's the one that I want. There can be this infantile identification with things or behaviors that are fundamentally resistant to change. And every year, the month of May begins with that Taurian sort of sense of, what do I want, going to the Geminian sense, hopefully, of, oh, maybe I don't really need that to the degree that I did, or maybe there are options that come up.
Yeah, I think that the sun moving into Gemini, I think options is a good word. I think that there's a sense when the sun is in Gemini that we can tune reality as if it was a radio. Meaning that it's like experiences and people and things and events are all like radio stations. And so they're all Taurus says, this is what I'm doing and this is what I am, and that sense of that rigidity of thinking, especially about one's possessions. But when the sun goes into Gemini, it's like, I think I'll tune the radio here. Now I'm bored. I think I'll tune it there. There's a sense of not having to commit because the radio stations are there. It's just, which one am I going to listen to today?
Yeah. But we have an interesting energetic contrast between the small operative planets, particularly Mercury and Venus. Mercury, the operation of how we see and communicate, and Venus, what we like or how we are in a social setting. Those, right now, Mercury is in jaunty Gemini and Venus is in bold Aries, so they're in air and fire, very dynamic, so we can be bubbly on the level of perception and perhaps even pleasure anticipation, yet we hold a Taurus center. And then in the latter part of the month, the sun, the center, shifts, opens up, moves into that radio-oriented receptive adaptability that Rick was talking about. But Mercury, Venus goes into Taurus on the 28th, and Mercury goes into Cancer. So much of the month, with the sun in Taurus, is like someone who's trying to handle a real estate issue or a serious financial issue, and all they see are pretty people and candy stores and attractive distractions. And then as we get to the end of the month, when it's fine to go and have our distractions, our values and our minds are growing more conservative. So it's like going on vacation and balancing your checkbook, or worrying about the mortgage payment all the time that you're on vacation. So we do have this kind of difference between the instruments of intellect and affinity, Mercury and Venus, and the essence of the energy, who we are and what we're trying to accomplish.
And I think this gets back to your opening words, and that becomes an issue all month, is the balancing between the earth, the feet on the ground, the building the ark, the having the container, the alembic to hold the reaction, that Saturn stuff, with Saturn trining Jupiter as part of one of the foundational pieces of the month, and yet at the same time, and with the sun in Taurus for most of the month, but at the same time we have, we move toward the new moon this month in Gemini. And that new moon is harmonized in trine to Mars and Libra, and again we have this dance between the center holding and the center kind of just dancing with whomever it wants to dance with next, whatever radio station it wants to hear.
Well, but the center is also dancing with some kind of narcotic.
That would be Neptune.
Neptune is square, a very close square right angle with the new moon. Now, Gemini isn't the most realistic sign in the zoo, and Neptune makes Gemini look like, an engineer. So this is a very, at its best, inspiring pattern, but quite frankly, on the level of ordinary reality, there's a lot of delusion and fantasy in it.
And Jeff said Neptune narcotic, because Neptune's job is to dissolve reality. I mean, Neptune is the god of rules the ocean, the seas. And the seas dissolve everything. And the seas of consciousness are the same thing. So all individuality, ego, separateness is dissolved by Neptune into this greater kind of ocean of consciousness, of imagination, of dreams, of spirituality, and any substance that helps dissolve the hard edges of reality is considered to be Neptunian. So like the ocean, or like alcohol, because alcohol dissolves those hard edges. It makes the boundaries go away, whether you're drinking it and the stop sign says slow down instead of stop, or whether you're using it in a laboratory to dissolve it's called the universal solvent by chemists, because Neptune, or that is alcohol, will dissolve things that water won't. And by the same token, that the whole idea of when we have a new moon square Neptune, there's that sense of being misled or attracted by the dream, and therefore any substance that makes things seem less real.
And I think especially so with a new moon in mobile Gemini. I mean, any new moon in Gemini, it's a starting point of a monthly cycle, but it's a monthly cycle of diversity and of distraction or of collecting data and information. So let's try to put this in a frame. And maybe the point is that May is, again, a time, this full moon in May, where we really hit a wall of reality. And that perhaps in sort of having maybe broken ground in the garden of our own desire, or having taken a committed step in a new direction toward either getting rid of something we don't need, which is very scorpionic, or moving towards something which we desire more deeply than what we have right now. If you do that right, I think this one says, okay, now let's have a break. This is not a new moon for material work as much as it is a new moon for spiritual work and for magical work. You know, it's not something you try to grab onto. And yet if the work is done, or if you establish some clarity in the middle of May, or in somewhere earlier in the month of May, then you can be comfortable enough to go, okay, I'm gonna, you know, read romance novels or watch rom-coms, or not focus so hard on my goals right now. But of course, where the work isn't done, this is the kind of stuff that sows panic or escapism. Holy crap, I didn't do my homework.
Right, and I think, just coming back, I think you're right, Jeff. I mean, the full moon is certainly a critical piece of this, and it's either the wall that we hit, or the need that, you know, to clarify or to, you know, make something real. And yet, I think the other piece that may be just as important, and that is the exact trine between Jupiter and Saturn, because remember, Saturn was a player in the full moon, and as Jupiter comes along and trines it, that's also, we don't have to wait for the new moon to sow the seed. In other words, this time right here, if you're doing magical work or doing ritual or creating intentions, this is an opportune few days, the days coming into and out of this trine between the planet of big thinking and expansive ideas and opportunity, and the planet of make it real.
Yeah, and I just had another view of how this big frame-setting Jupiter-Saturn trine can work even in a less desirable way, because it allows the pieces to slip together and create a framework. A philosophy and belief, expansion Jupiter, concreteness and contraction Saturn, a trine's an easy blend of the two. So what that means is, if you're not in a place that you want to be and you don't consider the larger issues, this can be a sort of transit that lures you into accepting, sliding into a job, a relationship, an attitude, a belief, or practice, or behaviors, just because they're there. In other words, we tend to look at the challenging astrological patterns as the ones that push us around. But there are also the sirens on the rocks that call us, the trines, or the easy patterns that, if not sort of brought into consciousness, can be every bit as complex and difficult as the hard ones.
Yeah. A last thought, or maybe a next to last thought, but another thought comes back to the Mars that's turning direct on the 19th. Now, Mars went retrograde
March 1st.
March 1st.
March 1st.
March 1st. Is there an echo in here? Mars went retrograde on March 1st, And it was the third planet since the beginning of the year to turn retrograde one after another after another. Venus had turned retrograde. The end of last year was retrograde through January. Then Mercury turned retrograde in February. And a couple days after it turned direct, Mars turned retrograde. It was like the baton was passed from one planet to another to another. And so you have all of this outer deep stuff, including the grand square, kind of creating these larger issues. And yet the interpersonal planets are basically still covering old ground or recovering old ground. And so I think that when Mars turns direct, even though it may take a few days or even a few weeks for us to feel the momentum, I think this is the last holdout. I think that, well, you know, if you're using a bow and arrow, it's like you pull back on the bow, and that's like the retrograde. And in a way, we've been pulling back for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months now, and Mars being the last one, when we let that go, I think that's where a lot of the stuff that we've been working on since the end of last year really begins to take form and move forward. And again, we may not notice it on the day Mars turns direct, but I think that the power behind this direct, especially because Mars has been such a key player in the squares to the, Uranus, the opposition to Uranus and square to Pluto and Jupiter, I think that that's going to be a really important piece of the month. And by June, I think we'll be feeling like we're moving into new ground for real.
Yeah, Mars will trigger oppose Uranus and square Pluto. So how can we use Mars in Libra in an effective way? Well, first, the bad stuff is it's a pretty boy, manipulative, nice Libra. You know, how does Mars in Libra operate? It's like, how do I get you to do this? Or how do I make you think this was your idea? And this is obviously an insincere and less...
It's Eddie Haskell in the old Leave It to Beaver.
That's right, particularly in the retrograde period. Yeah. It's something that's so nice to you that you just want to kick it someplace that will hurt it. But with Mars going forward in Libra, what that offers us is the opportunity to initiate. Now, we got big stuff to change in the world with these bigger Uranus, Pluto, and Jupiter outer planet patterns. So Mars now has backed off. It's going to turn around. It's going forward in Libra, which means that we're strategic. You're aware that you do things from a place of balance, with a sense of grace. How can the warrior or the actor Mars be in a place of moving forward, being alert to what's out there, and not become paralyzed? It is sort of this gracious, other-encompassing way of moving forward. And I think the chickening out happens if we get to Libra, if we're so worried about ruffling somebody else's feathers. Because if we're good Mars in Libras, we can ruffle feathers and then smooth them out, if that's what it takes to get to the next point. So trusting and engaging in your ability to handle conflict gracefully, not just to avoid conflict, but to use it in a way that moves things in your life with as much beauty as you can muster.